Welcome to Lecture 25. This lecture covers Chapter 25 in Bill Mounce's The Basics of Biblical Greek. This lecture covers the perfect tense and the middle voice. We are going to learn three things: the meaning of the perfect tense, in other words, its function; the morphology of the perfect tense, how the perfect tenses are formed; and then the meaning of the middle voice, how the middle voice functions. So far we've only covered deponent middles. Now we are going to look at proper middles. Section 1. The meaning of the perfect tense. How does the perfect tense function and how does it differ from other tenses? The perfect tense describes past action with present effects. In other words, the Greek perfect describes an action that was brought to completion in the past, but which has effects that are still felt in the present. This notion of past action with effects that are ongoing in the present time, bear in mind it's present from the point of view of the speaker or writer, not necessarily from the point of view of the reader. But this idea of past action with ongoing effects in the present time has no parallel in English. We can diagram the force of the perfect tense like this. You see an action that was completed in the past, represented by the circle or the dot in the past time. The effects of that action extend from the past into the present, being represented by the dotted line. So, past action, present effects. The perfect is such a rich and unusual tense that it is ideal for communicating some deep theological truths. It is a marked tense. By marked, we mean that when an author uses the perfect, they do so intentionally to make a point. The aorist is an unmarked tense. It's the one that authors use by default, but when they use a perfect, you should assume that it was done intentionally. Let's consider some simple examples of the theological potential of the perfect. We will start with one of the best known instances. The verb grapho, as you know, means to write, or I write rather. If we use it in the aorist passive, egraphe, it would mean it was written. You might note that egraphe is a second aorist passive, which is quite rare. Anyhow, it was written would simply refer to the fact that something was written in the past, making no assertion about the present value of the writing. However, if we use the perfect passive gegrapte, which is often used in the New Testament when referring to the Old Testament scriptures, the sense becomes it is written, or perhaps even it stands written. The theological point is rich. The Old Testament scriptures were written in the past, but their message speaks into the present. The next example is hypothetical, in other words, not used in our New Testament literature. The aorist, apethanen ho Jesus, Jesus died, would simply state the fact Jesus died, in the past of course. If we were to use the perfect tense instead, apothethneken ho Jesus, Jesus has died, we would add a nuance that the effects of his death are active and powerful into the present time. What a beautiful nuance that would be. So the perfect tense has the potential to convey rich theological truth, and it's almost always a marked tense. This simple diagram illustrates the differences between the three Greek tenses that cover past time action. Technically speaking, the perfect is not considered a past tense, but it does portray an action that took place in the past. The aorist simply describes an event that took place in the past. It says nothing about the duration of the action or the continuing effects of the action, merely that something happened. We can represent it as a dot in the past time. The imperfect describes ongoing action in the past time, durative action. We symbolize this with a solid line in the past. The perfect portrays an action completed in the past, the dot, with effects stretching into the present, the dotted line. So three kinds of action that can take place in the past: undefined action, the aorist; ongoing action, the imperfect; or completed action with continuing effects, the perfect. When Greek uses the perfect tense, the emphasis can fall either on the completed action, called an extensive perfect, or on the present effects, called an intensive perfect. The little diagram illustrates the difference. The perfect always has both components, both completed action and present effects, but the context can draw attention to one of these more than the other. If the focus falls on the past event, then we have an extensive perfect represented by the big dot and the thin dotted line. If the focus falls on the present effects, we have an intensive perfect represented by the small dot and the thick dotted line. So it's a matter of where the emphasis falls, whether on the present or on the past aspect of the perfect. How do you tell which it is? You can only do that based on the context. How do we translate the perfect? We usually translate the perfect with the helping verb has or have combined with the participle form of the English verb, such as has healed or have come. Remember that the aorist can also be translated this way, so you cannot always tell from an English translation whether the underlying Greek verb is aorist or perfect tense. When the focus is on the present effects, we sometimes use is with the participle form of the English verb. In other words, this applies to the so-called intensive use of the perfect. We saw this with it is written to translate gegrapte. Here are two examples of the translation of perfect tenses. Firstly, in Mark 4 verse 34, we read, Jesus speaking, Tigater, he pistis su sesoken se, which translates, Daughter, your faith has saved you. The perfect tense verb in this sentence is sesoken, meaning it has saved. Secondly, in Matthew 3 verse 2, we read Jesus speaking and saying, Engiken gar he vasilia ton uranon, for the kingdom of heaven is near. The perfect tense verb is engiken, meaning it has drawn near or it is near. This is an intensive use of the perfect, emphasizing the present result of a past action. As a result of Christ's coming, the kingdom is now near. And so the perfect tense in this case is rendered using the verb is. So normally rendered using the helping verb has or have with the participle, but sometimes we can use is with an English participle. Section 2. The morphology of the perfect tense. Now we're going to turn to see how perfect tense verbs are formed so that you can recognize them when you encounter them. This chart shows the building blocks for the perfect active indicative. The first element is called reduplication. We will explain this later in this lesson, but essentially the first letter of the stem is repeated combined with the letter epsilon. So because the stem li starts with lambda, we have the repeated lambda combined with epsilon to give us the reduplication le. Then the perfect tense stem li. The perfect tense formative for the active is kappa alpha, ka, and primary active personal endings. The perfect tense is not an augmented tense. The reduplication that you see at the start of the perfect tense is not an augment, it is reduplication. Technically speaking, therefore, the perfect is not an augmented tense, and because it's not an augmented tense, it takes the primary personal endings. So the building blocks of our perfect: reduplication, le, plus perfect tense stem, li, plus tense formative, ka, plus primary active personal endings, there's none for the one singular, gives us lelika, I have loosed. Here is the paradigm for the perfect active indicative. The one singular, lelika, It's formed from the reduplication le plus the tense stem li plus the perfect tense formative ka. There's no personal ending in the one singular. This gives us lelika, I have loosed. The two singular, lelikas, reduplication le, tense stem li, tense formative ka, and the two singular personal ending sigma gives us lelikas, you have loosed. The three singular, lelike or leliken, we have reduplication le, tense stem li, tense formative ke. You'll be familiar from the aorist that the sa goes to se. In other words, alpha changes to epsilon in the three singular form. Exactly the same thing happens in the perfect active. There is no personal ending, but there's an optional movable ni in the three singular. This gives us lelike or leliken, he, she, or it has loosed. The one plural, lelikamen, reduplication le, tense stem li, tense formative ka, personal ending for the one plural, men. Lelikamen, we have loosed. The two plural, lelikate, reduplication le, tense stem li, tense formative ka, and the two plural personal ending te, lelikate, you have loosed. And finally the three plural, lelikasi or lelikasin, reduplication le, tense stem li, tense formative ka, and the three plural ending nsi with the optional movable ni. As we've seen in previous examples, the ni drops out when followed by sigma within the personal ending, and thus we get lelikasi or lelikasin, they have loosed. This chart shows the building blocks for the perfect middle passive indicative. The first thing to note is that the middle and passive forms are identical as they were in the present tense, so only context would distinguish the middle from the passive. We start with the reduplication, then we have the perfect tense stem. There is no tense formative and no connecting vowel for the perfect passive. The primary passive personal endings are added directly to the tense stem. This gives us lelime, I have been loosed. Here is the paradigm for the perfect middle passive indicative. The one singular, lelime, reduplication le, tense stem li, personal ending me, lelime, I have been loosed. The two singular, lelise, reduplication le, tense stem li, personal ending se. Notice we use the proper full personal ending in this case. Gives us lelise, you have been loosed. Three singular, lelite, reduplication le, tense stem li, personal ending te, lelite, he, she, or it has been loosed. One plural, lelimetha, reduplication le, tense stem li, personal ending metha, lelimetha, we have been loosed. Two plural, lelisthe, reduplication le, tense stem li, personal ending sthe, lelisthe, you have been loosed. And three plural, lelinte, reduplication le, tense stem li, personal ending nte, lelinte, they have been loosed. The reduplication at the start of a perfect tense verb is a key diagnostic for the perfect. You need to know how it works. So we are going to take a few slides to explain how reduplication works. If a verb begins with a consonant, the initial consonant is doubled and separated from the stem by an epsilon. This is best understood by looking at a few basic examples. Let's take the stem pistev from the verb pistevo, meaning I believe, and form the perfect. The perfect tense would become pepistevka. You can see the reduplication. The stem starts with P. We've doubled the P and separated the second P from the stem with epsilon, hence the pepistevka. Similarly, gena, the stem for the verb genao, meaning I give birth, becomes gegeneka. Once again, we start with a consonant gamma, which is duplicated and separated from the stem with epsilon, and thus we form gegeneka. Just as with other contract verbs, this is an alpha contract, and the final alpha lengthens to eta before the tense formative is added. That's why gena becomes gene. Lastly, lale, the root for laleo, I say, begins with lambda. The initial lambda is doubled, separated with epsilon, hence we get le laleka. So reduplication. In most cases where the verb begins with a consonant, the consonant is doubled and separated from the tense stem with epsilon. If the initial consonant is a stop, the square of stops sometimes comes into play. It comes into play specifically when the initial consonant is an aspirate, phi, chi, or theta. The aspirates reduplicate with the corresponding voiceless stop. So phi reduplicates using p, chi reduplicates using kappa, and theta reduplicates using tau. This will make best sense if you look at an example of each. The root fanero begins with the aspirate phi. When we form the perfect, the aspirate phi reduplicates using the voiceless stop p. Hence we get pefaneroka instead of fefaneroka. Turning to the root chorid, which begins with the aspirate chi, it reduplicates using kappa. This yields kechorisme instead of chechorisme. Lastly, the root therapev, which begins with the aspirate theta, forms its perfect passive as te therapevme. You can see again that the initial theta reduplicates not using another theta, but rather using a tav. Hence we get te therapevme instead of the therapevme. Why did this happen? Well, apparently the ancient Greeks found it easier to pronounce words this way. They found it difficult to have the two aspirates close together, so whenever there was an initial aspirate and they needed to reduplicate, they switched to the corresponding voiceless stop. If a verb begins with a vowel or a diphthong, the vowel does not reduplicate. Instead, it lengthens in exactly the same way as when a vocalic augment is formed. We can see two quick examples. Let's take the stem agapa. Going to try to duplicate the initial alpha. That simply doesn't work. So alpha lengthens to eta, exactly as it would if we were adding a vocalic augment. How would you know it's a perfect tense in this case? Well, the tense formative kappa alpha would be the key diagnostic. Another example, if we take the root ete, alpha iota, as the initial diphthong, when we add the vocalic augment or when we try to reduplicate, the initial alpha iota goes to eta with an iota subscript. So we get the perfect as eteka. Once again, in these instances, where there's an initial vowel that's lengthening, the initial lengthened vowel won't be a key diagnostic to tell you it's a perfect, because that diagnostic could apply equally to an imperfect or to an aorist. In these cases, the distinctive kappa alpha as the tense formative, or in the case of the passives, having the personal endings attached directly to the stem, will alert you that you're looking at a perfect. Also, remember that if the lengthened initial vowel is an augmented tense, we're going to have secondary personal endings attached. This would apply to both the imperfect and the aorist tenses, but since the perfect is not an augmented tense, we're going to have primary endings attached. This is another way that you can also distinguish between an imperfect or an aorist on the one hand and a perfect on the other. And finally, on the subject of reduplication, what happens when a verb has a preposition in compound? Well, if a verb has a preposition in compound, it's the verbal part of the verb that reduplicates. Just as you add the augment to the verbal part of the compound, So you add the reduplication to the verbal part of the compound. In other words, the reduplication comes after the preposition but before the verbal stem, the tense stem. Mounce gives one example which we reproduce. If we take the root ek vowel, when we form the perfect, firstly the root vowel goes to vle for the tense stem of the perfect, but notice that the reduplication ve is attached directly to the verbal stem vle. This gives us ek vevleka, ek vevleka. This is not new. You're used to seeing this on aorists as well as imperfects when augments are added. The last thing that we need to mention about the perfect tense is that just as there are second aorists, so too there are second perfects. In other words, some verbs form their perfect using a second perfect tense stem and using some different formations. There are not very many of these in the New Testament, and Mounce doesn't recommend expending too much energy trying to memorize them. He does list some of the more common ones that you're likely to occur. They are akekoa, the perfect of akuo, gegona, the perfect of ginome, ilefa, the perfect of lamvano, gegrafa, the perfect of grafo, elelitha, the perfect of erchome, and lastly, the word either, the word for I know. Either is actually a second perfect, but it's used as a present. Section 3. The middle voice. Mounce uses this opportunity to present more fully how the middle voice functions in Greek. When he first introduced it, he glossed over that pretty quickly, opting to use only deponent middles until now. But he takes this opportunity to explain the grammar of the middle voice in a little bit more detail. So against that background, let's learn some of the basics of the middle voice. As you already know, whereas English has two voices, an active and a passive, Greek has three voices. The Greek active and passive closely mirrors the English active and passive. The active voice depicts the subject as performing the action of the verb, while the passive voice depicts the subject as receiving the action of the verb. English does not have a middle voice like Greek does. So what is the third function, this middle voice? Well, in the middle voice, the subject performs the action, but the action in some way affects the subject. Mounce calls this the self-interest nuance of the middle. This nuance takes a few different forms. We're going to look at two of them in a moment, but the common ingredient is that the action in some way affects the subject. So that's the key point. The middle portrays the subject as performing the action of the verb just like the active does, but the action in some way affects the subject. There's this nuance of self-interest involved. In the next 3 slides, we are going to have a look at the 3 most common and most important uses of the middle voice in the New Testament. Firstly, the deponent middle. The middle voice is often used with the force and meaning of an active voice. The subject performs the action, and there isn't a clear self-interest nuance involved. The deponent middle often applies, in fact almost exclusively applies, when there's a middle voice but no corresponding active form. In these cases, the middle form does the job of the active. It's active in meaning, even though it's middle in form. The deponent middle is the most common use of the middle in Koine Greek, certainly in the New Testament. Let's look at a few common examples of verbs that are deponent. Ginome, I become. Diname, I am able. Ergazome, I work. Erchome, I come. Porevome, I go. You've seen all of these verbs already, and you already know that even though they are middle in form, they are active in meaning. They are used as deponents. Next is the indirect middle. In the indirect middle, the subject does the action of the verb to a direct object, but the participation of the subject is emphasized. There's some nuance that this has something extra to do with the subject who's performing the action. This use of the middle is fairly common in Koine Greek, and probably after deponent is the most common usage. Let's look at two examples, one from Matthew and one from Luke. Firstly, in Matthew 27 verse 12, we read, Ouden apekrinato. This is Jesus on trial, and the statement is made that he answered nothing. Ouden apekrinato. The sense is that he answered nothing for himself, nothing in defense of his own case. So the middle voice is used here instead of a simple active to emphasize that he answered nothing in his own defense. This nuance, indirect nuance, but it's got something specific to do with the subject, is present. Secondly, in Acts 5 verse 2, the passage in which Ananias kept back some of the money that he had promised to give to the church, we read, Enos physato apotes times. The verb enos physato is middle. We can translate this as he kept back some of the price. The verb he kept back, though, has this nuance of self-interest. It's kind of he kept it back to his own benefit or in his own interest or for himself. He kept back some of the price for himself. In both of these cases, the subject is not performing the action upon itself, as it will in the next example, the direct middle, but is performing the action in a way that somehow interests him or itself. This is the key idea of the indirect middle. The subject does the action of the verb to a direct object, but the participation of the subject is emphasized. Last of all, there's the direct middle. This is also called the reflexive middle. In the direct middle, the subject performs and receives the action of the verb. In other words, the subject performs the action upon itself. This is why we call it the reflexive use of the middle. But it's not common in Koine Greek. This used to be a common use of the middle in classical Greek, but by the time of Koine Greek, Greek has started to use the reflexive pronoun heavton to denote this idea of himself or itself. So you do it to yourself or for yourself. And thus the direct or reflexive use of the middle is fading. But there are some examples in the New Testament. One great one is in Matthew 27 verse 5, talking about Judas after he had betrayed Jesus. It said that he went out and apexato, he hanged himself. Apexato is a middle voice. The text doesn't have a separate word that says himself. Apexato is that he hanged someone, but he hanged himself. So he performed the action upon himself. Similarly, in Luke 12 verse 37, we find the form perizosete, which means he will gird himself. It's a middle. So he will gird. Who will he gird? He will gird himself. The idea is that the subject is performing the action, girding, upon itself. He's girding himself. So this reflexive idea, not a common use in the New Testament. There are a few examples, in fact quite a few examples, but it's certainly not the dominant nuance anymore, as it may have been in earlier times. In the interaction that follows, we will explain some of the perfect tense forms in exercise 25. We will select 10 of the perfect tense verbs in exercise 25, somewhat arbitrarily, and divide them into their constituent parts so that you can see how they are formed. We shall focus on the perfect forms since we covered the middle voice forms in an earlier lecture. Agapeka. Agapeka is perfect active indicative, one singular, from agapao. The inflected form means I have loved. The root is agapa. We have vocalic reduplication. The initial alpha lengthens to eta. This is identical to the vocalic augment, and thus does not serve as a clear diagnostic for the perfect. However, the perfect tense formative, ka, kappa alpha, clearly identifies this as a perfect active. There is no personal ending in the one singular, hence we get egapeka. Pepistevmetha. Pepistevmetha is perfect middle or passive indicative one plural, from pistevo. The inflected form means we have been believed. The root is pistev. We have the normal reduplication. The initial p is doubled and joined to the tense stem with epsilon. The reduplication with epsilon is a clear diagnostic for the perfect tense. The perfect middle and passive has no tense formative and no connecting vowel. The passive personal ending is attached directly to the stem, yielding pepistevmetha. Gegenese. Gegenese is perfect middle or passive indicative two singular from genao. The inflected form means I have been begotten. The root is gena. We have normal reduplication. The initial gamma is doubled and joined to the tense stem with epsilon. The reduplication with epsilon is a clear diagnostic for the perfect tense. The perfect middle or passive has no tense formative and no connecting vowel. The passive personal ending is attached directly to the stem. Whereas the proper two singular passive personal ending, sigma, alpha, iota, often changes due to the intervocalic sigma dropping out. This does not happen in the perfect. Hence you can see the proper two singular ending, se, in gegenese. Kekleste. Kekleste is perfect middle or passive indicative, two plural from kaleo. The inflected form means you have been called. The root is kale, but the perfect tense stem changes to clay. We have normal reduplication. The initial kappa is doubled and joined to the tense stem with epsilon. The reduplication with epsilon is a clear diagnostic for the perfect tense. The perfect middle and passive has no tense formative and no connecting vowel. The passive personal ending is attached directly to the tense stem, yielding kekleste. Ekolutheken. Ekolutheken is perfect active indicative three singular from akolutheo. The inflected form means we have followed. The root is akoluthe. We have vocalic reduplication. The initial alpha lengthens to eta. This vocalic reduplication is identical to the vocalic augment, and thus it does not serve by itself as a clear diagnostic for the perfect. However, the perfect tense formative ka, kappa alpha, which changes to ke, kappa epsilon in the three singular, clearly identifies this as a perfect active. There's no personal ending in the three singular, but there is an optional movable ni. This gives us ekolutheken. Egnokan. Egnokan is perfect active indicative third person plural from ginosko. The inflected form means they have known. The root is gno. There is no reduplication. Instead, we have a simple augment attached. For some reason, which is unknown to me, verbs that begin with two consonants often take an augment in the perfect tense instead of reduplicating the initial vowel. This is why we have egnokan instead of gegnokan. If the absence of reduplication creates a risk of thinking this may be an aorist, the perfect tense formative ka, kappa alpha, clearly identifies it as a perfect active. The three plural personal ending is ni, yielding egnokan. Sesokate. Peplerote. Peplerote is perfect middle or passive indicative three singular from pleroo. The inflected form means he, she, or it has been filled or fulfilled. The root is plero. We have normal reduplication. The initial p is doubled and joined to the tense stem with epsilon. Reduplication with epsilon is a clear diagnostic for the perfect tense. The perfect middle or passive has no tense formative and no connecting vowel. The passive personal ending is attached directly to the stem. Note that the final stem vowel of the contract verb lengthens to omega when the personal ending is attached. The three singular passive ending is te, yielding peplerote. Vevlete. Etekomen. Etekomen is perfect active indicative 1 plural, from eteo. The inflected form means we have asked. The root is ete, alpha iota, tav epsilon. We have vocalic reduplication for a word that starts with a diphthong. The initial alpha lengthens to eta, and the iota subscripts. This is identical to vocalic augmentation, and thus does not serve as a clear diagnostic for the perfect. However, the perfect tense formative ka, kappa alpha, clearly identifies this as a perfect tense. The active 1 plural personal ending is men. Putting the pieces together we get etekomen. This is the end of lecture 25.